I might actually like to start with a land acknowledgement, and I'm going to use the land acknowledgement statement from the University of Toronto's LGBTQ+ student organization, LGBT Out. I would like to acknowledge the sacred land on which the University of Toronto operates. It's been a site of human activity for over 15,000 years. This land belonged to the Wyandot people in pre-colonial times before changing hands several times from the Haudenosaunee, the Neutral, the Wyandot, Teonantati, and finally ending with the settling of the Anishinaabe Mississaugas. The territory consists of ceded land covered under the Toronto Treaty 13 of the Upper Canada Land Surrenders and the Williams Treaties, as well as unceded land that continues to be contested. Today, Toronto is the home to many Aboriginal peoples, including First Nation status Indians, non-status Indians, as well as Metis and Inuit peoples from across the continent. We can never work to end systemic and institutional violence if we do not center the narratives of Aboriginal peoples in our collective decision-making for social justice and equity. As settlers on this territory, we directly benefit from a colonial culture that has overseen the genocide, systematic oppression, and exploitation of Aboriginal peoples. In order to engage in resistance and solidarity against the injustices inflicted on the Aboriginal peoples of this land, it is imperative we constantly engage in acts of awareness and decolonization. I'd also like to pay respects to the Aboriginal leaders and traditional teachers, both past and present, and to those who are here with us today, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. So I decided to use this particular land acknowledgement because of its focus on social justice and equity and the direct connections drawn between historical events and today. And also the fact that this is the situation in Toronto. Toronto has a lot of different peoples, Indigenous and non, despite the privileging of one group of people. I'd also like to thank Urvashi, Chakravarty, and Liza, not just for the opportunity, but also for practicing a politics of care in cultivating a truly inclusive and equitable space at a time when most conferences are deciding to go back to the status quo. Those of you who are online can't see, but everyone in here is masked. The windows are open, which means I can be here. And I'd also like to thank everyone whose labor has contributed to this fantastic conference. So for the past few years, I've been working on late Roman and early medieval Italian racialization, or racialization in Italy, I should say, and concurrently modern Italian conceptions of race and the use of Roman and early medieval history in constructing Italian national identity. And I also use racialization to really highlight that process, in part because medieval historians often are very dismissive of the idea of race in the pre-modern period. So today, I will focus on the genealogies of scholarship, on the Lombards in Italy from the 19th century to the present, and the racial logic behind that. And I'll also end by looking at a little bit at a 7th century Lombard genealogy, the Origo Gentis Longobardorum, or the origin of the Lombard peoples. And Gentis, that word is gens, genealogy, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. That text, the Origo, was written in the 7th century and attached to the Lombard laws promulgated by King Rothari in the 7th century in 643, the first king to issue a written law code for the kingdom. It basically traces the Lombards to this island of Scandia, often assumed to be Scandinavian earlier scholarship, and it gives a mythical reason for their name, and then it more or less is a list of kings. It's one of many early medieval Origo Gentium, origin of peoples, which both conceive of the royal families and the groups in question in biological terms. Although, as Herwig Wolfram noted in the 1990s, the gens often means army, which was fundamentally a multi-ethnic army. For Lombard Italy and Ostrogothic Italy beforehand, as with other barbarian kingdoms, as part of the larger debates over the transformation of the Roman world in the 90s and 2000s, scholars focused on whether this whole genre of Origo Gentis, or Gentium, should be read as literature that served to construct a collective memory at the time of its production, as Walter Goffert and the Toronto School argued, or whether there were core ethnic traditions that were transmitted orally and preserved within them, as Herwig Wolfram and the Vienna School asserted. Wolfram's early research on ethnicity saw it as developing from a core of stable and immutable Traditionskern, or kernels of tradition, an idea that was developed in 1961 by Reinhard Venskes. Critiques of that by Andrew Gillette in 2002 and others has led to a refinement of these concepts of ethnicity using anthropological and postmodern theory. Analyzing the Origogentium as a group, Walter Pohl recently concluded that they were myths of long-distance migration and successful conquest of former Roman territories, or, quote, narratives of integration into a Christian and a post-Roman world in which, quote, unquote, barbarians strove to maintain their separate identities. Okay. So debates over ethnogenesis, or the creation of ethnic groups, and whether ethnicity should be a concept at all, were really contentious in the 90s and 2000s. I was actually a grad student in the early 2000s and was really kind of surprised by this. And one of the reasons, the reason that I bring this up, is that the Toronto school saw the Vienna school as using new terminology to support older ideas, which some were linked to the Nazis. Basically, they saw the use of ethnicity just replacing the older use of the term race. And if you look at earlier translations of, well, various early medieval texts and late antique texts, gens is often translated as race. So they very much wanted to depart from this idea of race, and that is one of the reasons that early medievalists don't like the use of the term race, but we all know that no, we were not talking about race in a 19th century biological way. So today, the study of ethnicity is not controversial, but the Toronto School's critique that just shifting the language we use without the structure doesn't change anything remains valid. And that's something that Kimberly Crenshaw is talking about in terms of colorblindness. So they're definitely not using critical race theory, but it is actually a valid criticism. However, they instead just argued that ethnicity is not a useful concept for studying early medieval peoples. That's kind of where they stopped. What I want to stress, however, is that having a narrow focus on what the word gens actually means, or what the true composition of a gens is, ignores that these social constructs, including race and ethnicity and gender, are depicted as having a biological basis, which is what makes them so powerful. As anthropologists have been arguing for decades, there is no biological basis for race. The same goes for ethnicities. They're not closed biological groups. What is meaningful is looking at the social construction and the logic behind it. Once those biological ideas are in place, they are also policed in biological terms. You get associated ideas of purity, issues of finding who belongs, and of degeneration, fears of that group degenerating into something else. And we'll look at a specific example later. So when we think about these texts and race and gender and their intersections, we should think about what purpose does that biologizing serve? I'm not sure if I made up a word. Who does it serve? And as Miles said earlier, the preoccupation with racial nationalism is really about ensuring these common descendants, and that's where all of this policing leads to. So recently, maybe a month ago, the president of the American Historical Association, James Sweet, lamented the move towards presentism through the discipline, including those of us working on pre-modern topics. And many scholars, particularly Black historians, noted all of the issues of this, and there's lots of stuff on Twitter about it. And the major critiques of the, which really is about the erasure and trivialization of the experiences of Black scholars in general and in and their experiences in the archives in particular are really the most important point, but I do actually want to address it just a tiny bit as an early medievalist. I do think that studying the past, modern uses of the past, and the gulf between the two, because there is a difference between the two, can allow us to imagine other ways of being, and I don't think in any sense that's a betrayal of the discipline of history. And on that note as well, I was really heartened by Dr. Cooper's talk and how she really displayed that as well. So these genealogies are themselves constructed to present a particular image of lineage, of connection, and even gens or nationhood. They're not the whole story. Who is missing, both in the 7th century genealogies and in citations in modern scholarship, matters. And this is what history can do. Instead of anachronistically trying to make the past look like the present, which was Sweet's argument of what we're doing, we can uncover the logic behind both pre-modern and modern belief systems. Also, just on a personal note, I am invested in improving the material conditions of people like myself and other peoples, and continuing to support the status quo is also a political statement. Early medieval history, as many people probably know, is a very white and very male field. And so just in terms of just a couple of my intellectual debts, the work of Julia Smith and Leslie Brubaker, the Byzantinist, has been fundamental, but also many scholars outside of medieval history, Audre Lorde and Frantz Fanon in particular, but also in terms of thinking about race in the pre-modern, and this, when I first started working on that, I was, for a different reason, looking at Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism. And there's like a page and a half on the early history of race. And I don't know if he's, and I agree with a lot of it, and some of it, like, again, it's this really, really short thing I don't agree with. But Cedric Robinson was talking about how race works in the pre-modern period. So, and you know, like, just, so, and that's a major intellectual debt as well. So recent research has become more nuanced, but what essentially recent research on the early medieval period in early medieval history has done has designated some quote-unquote barbarian groups, and they're just issues about the terminology, like what should we call them? Germanic doesn't work, barbarian doesn't work. Some of these post-Roman groups as part of the tradition of late antiquity. But basically they've said, okay, Ostrogoths can be late antique, well, Lombards are still early medieval, but that doesn't challenge the racial thinking and assumptions at the core of the discipline's founding. So groups like the Ostrogoths can be incorporated into Romanness, but the Lombards can't, since they fragmented the peninsula. And that's an event commonly seen as, in scholarship as pushing Italy into the Middle Ages. This idea goes back to the 19th century. I mean, well, arguably, there's some really interesting analysis of this from the 16th to 19th centuries. I have not looked at that yet. Eventually I will for my book, though. And just so you all know what I'm talking about, this is Italy in, these are just some images from Wikipedia. Italy in 572. The thing with the Lombards is that they didn't, the blue is Lombard, the orange is Byzantine, so it was an incomplete conquest. And then this is 652. There's more, but you can see the Lombard kingdom is still really fragmented. And they get almost all of the peninsula in 751, but then 774, the Carolingians conquer them. So this idea of fragmenting the peninsula, that's really where it comes from. It's just a good visual. Back to here. So 19th and 20th century nationalists used contemporary ideas of race to simultaneously create an Italian national identity that staked a claim to Italian and Roman whiteness by rejecting the Middle Ages and foreign influence, both German/Germanic influence in the north, as well as Byzantine, Greek, and Muslim or North African influence in the south. Racialization in modern Italy, based on an association of Romanness and whiteness, has developed in part of the larger nationalist project that created modern nation states and the idea of Europe. Nevertheless, in the modern period, Italian claims to whiteness have had to contend with a complicated history, from differing views of race and the inclusion of people later racialized as non-white in Romanness — the Romans did not have a concept of whiteness — to political fragmentation and dominance by other European groups, as well as continuing interaction with and inclusion of, as well as at times rule by, non-Christians, particularly in Sicily. Sicily is often just kind of left out entirely because it's complicated to deal with in terms of these big narratives. Italian interest in the role of the Lombards in the history of the Italian peninsula can be traced to the Risorgimento and the creation of the Kingdom of Italy, and has remained important to modern Italian identity and racism. In Italy, after the failed revolutions of 1848 and an attempt by Charles Albert, the King of Sardinia-Piedmont in northwest Italy, to wage war against the Austrians who ruled over much of northern Italy, Giuseppe Mazzini and other revolutionaries formed the Committee for National Insurrection, which is a name I love, in order to plan what came to be called the War of Liberation from Austria. In the aftermath of the French Revolution, historical writing in Western Europe argued that there was a marked and enduring division between invaders and invaded, sometimes called the two-race theory. Unlike in Italy and Germany, where early medieval groups were seen as the sort of core foundation for the modern states, quote-unquote Germanic invaders were seen as disastrously dividing the peninsula. So Alessandro Manzoni, a historian of Lombard Italy famous for his poetry and novels, fused these interests in his novel Adokai, a tragedy based on the life of Adocus, the son of the last Lombard king Desiderius. While in his scholarship, he ignited the debate over the role of the Lombards. Manzoni applied the two-race theory to Cisalpine Gaul, arguing that the Lombards were barbarians who wiped out Roman tradition and thus constituted a fundamental break with the Roman past. By the end of the 1830s, Cesare Balbo and Carlo Troia agreed with Manzoni that the Lombard invasions had destroyed Roman civil institutions and argued that the popes and bishops were the people's only defenders. Both men were neo-Guelphs, which basically means they were part of a political movement that sought to unify Italy under the leadership of the pope, which is definitely not what happened. In the 1850s, Troia published the Codice Diplomatico Longobardo, the diplomatic charters of the Lombard, of the Lombard Kingdom, which has been a fundamental source for scholarship on the period. Troia's 5-volume charter collection began to be updated by Luigi Schiaparelli in 1929, but he only published volumes 1 and 2 by 1933. The rest of the series by the same name has been published by the Istituto Storico Italiano per il Medioevo, the Italian Historical Institute for the Middle Ages, formerly l'Istituto Storico Italiano, the Italian History Institute, which published Schiaparelli's work beginning in the 1970s. So it's only in the 1970s that even just the rest of those came to be published again. And many libraries here in the US don't have a complete set of the newer volumes. And scholars, which means that scholars at times do rely on Troia's work. Before unification, teaching history played a minor role in Italian universities, and only a few universities even had history chairs. Following unification, courses on ancient and modern history were required in literature and philosophy faculties with the University Regulation of 1862, and within 15 years, historical studies became firmly established, aiming both to lay ground for history as a scientific discipline and also to train secondary school teachers. This second concern would be fundamental in disseminating historical ideas to the broader Italian population, as would archaeology projects and museum exhibits. So Manzoni's ideas remain the dominant interpretive framework of the Lombards through most of the 20th century in academic circles. The major Italian scholars of the 20th century, Gian Pietro Bognetti and Ottorino Bartolini, both argued that the Lombard and Roman population remained separate throughout the period of the Lombard kingdom, and therefore that once the Carolingians conquered them, the Lombards disappeared as a people. As Gaspari notes, even Paolo Delogu, an eminent scholar of early medieval Italy, in his 1980 book, basically The Lombard Kingdom is the title, depicted the Lombards as a barbarian group that remained separate from the larger Roman population, and their conquest as inevitable because they could not integrate into the Romano-Byzantine world. Delogu has, in his 35 years since then, has definitely grown and changed in his thoughts, so I don't want to misrepresent him. Archaeology also played a fundamental role in how Italians understood themselves in relation to the Roman past and other peoples, imagined as the new barbarians. I've done a bunch of work on that, so I'm not going to talk about it too much. But basically, archaeology was a tool of colonial control. And that was not limited to Italy. All of the major powers in the 19th and 20th century used it to claim the right to interpret the historical natures of their conquests and basically disassociate the peoples living there from their own pasts. So via archaeology, Italians and other Europeans positioned themselves as the proper guardians of ancient remains instead of the local populations, who were instead viewed as primitive in comparison both with the archaeologists and also when compared to the antique civilization being excavated, and thus also lacking authentic ties to their land. So it had real effect. In Libya, remains of Roman monuments and ancient farmsteads demonstrated Roman imperialism, whereas in areas where Roman remains were expected but not found, such as in much of Tripoli, they blamed the barbarism of local Arabs and Amazigh, while Ethiopia was portrayed as detached from the Mediterranean and thus without any civilization. So one of my major arguments, building on the work of classicists including Shelley P. Haley, Rebecca Fudo Kennedy, and Benjamin Isaac, is that in the 6th through 8th century, the 6th through 8th centuries were still operating under Roman racial logic and should generally be seen as post-Roman. And that logic is never as hegemonic as modern ideas of race and whiteness. It was much more localized, and there were other ideas coming out of China and various areas of the world. But at the same time, in this period, newer ideas that would develop into ideas about race associated with Christianity were being developed and would eventually largely but not entirely replace Roman ones. And what I'm going to do, we're just going to look at how this works in the case of the treatment of royal women in Lombard Italy. This is actually, there's a good example in Ostrogothic Italy prior to that as well. So traditionally, scholars have argued that the succession of kings in the late 6th and early 7th century demonstrates a division of the Lombard nobility into two opposing political camps, one of ethnic traditionalists, often aligned with Arian Christianity, and pro-Roman, seen as being influenced by Catholicism. Although there were probably factions amongst the Lombard nobility, there's no real evidence for these enduring, unchanging camps fighting for control. So Francesco Borri has argued for the barbarian turn, or a restyled, consciously barbarian Lombard identity that rejected more Roman forms of authority, which spread from the Lombard aristocracy through the entire kingdom, thus allowing anyone who wanted to participate in the state to become a Lombard. But that is any man, because women were denied political participation, although Lombard law did also apply to women, and thus constructed them as Lombard subjects, even if they had no standing before the law. Therefore, as Lombard identity was refashioned to stress martial values, political and legal participation, and lineage, it allowed more men to become Lombard via their actions, while calling into question the Lombard identity of royal women because of their lineage. And so the Origo and later genealogies omit the 7th century queen Gundapurga, and she was the daughter of the celebrated but foreign-born Lombard queen Theodolinda, because her husband, King Ruthari, distanced himself from the politics of Gundapurga's family. And however, at the time of his ascension, he needed Gundapurga to legitimize his rule. And I'm just going to show you two things. Whoops. Just over here, Theodolinda, what happens in the early Lombard kingdom is kind of complicated. Is that here Theodolinda was born in Bavaria. She was the wife of one King Athari, and then her second husband basically used her to legitimate his rule. Gundapurga is her daughter, and she's the one who's really left out. But similarly, she legitimized the rule of two different kings. So this is, and you don't have to read it, we know every single king of the Lombards, and their reigns at least, even if we don't absolutely know the year that they were born. But I'm just going to look at this genealogy. But just looking at this tree, one thing that we can sort of see here is that we have, this I worked out for an article fairly recently. We have some of the information on some of the queens, but here I just have sister, married. We know that some woman, a royal woman, married this duke, and things of that nature. Whoops. And also just looking down at the bottom, we know that there is a queen, Rajintruda. We know it because we have some epigraphy for her. We know she was married to an 8th century king. We have no idea her lineage at all, who she was even married to. And so, and there's actually quite a bit of that. Gundapurga is left out entirely of this, of the Origo, and basically, she was also, a 7th century account, Fredegar, details the conflict between her and her husband, stating that the Lombards saw her as Francigiana, of Frankish descent. She was a Lombard princess. She was, but her mother, well, this suggests that with this political realignment, the Lombard aristocracy denied Gundapurga Lombard identity while simultaneously accepting her royal lineage. Her foreignness shows the unstable and gendered nature of 7th century Lombard ethnicity and ethnicity more generally, as Rothari and the aristocracy depicted themselves as Lombard warriors. However, to discredit her brother, Fredegar depicted him as preoccupied with bathing in oils and a pawn of the Byzantines. These are attributes that are unmanly and traitorous, but they're attacking his masculinity as opposed to his lineage. And we also have this example with the Ostrogoths and Amalasuintha's son as well. And so this is something that women are attacked based on their ethnicity and identity. Men are attacked on their manliness. So, and we can definitely talk about this a lot more. So similar to the Franks and Gregory of Tours, the categories of inclusion to Lombard ethnicity under Rothari were limited to men, and thus Gundapurga is dismissed as foreign, while her brother was depicted as not embodying Lombard values. But he's not accused of being a foreigner, nor is his cousin when he becomes king. So these Lombard genealogies highlight these issues of what we don't know, and why. We have to look at these exclusions in addition to just looking at what the genealogies do tell us. And I'd be happy to discuss this more. So thank you.
We didn't yell at you this time, which is very exciting. So please raise your hand. Please let me know if you would like to talk with or back to that paper. Yes, Scott.
Thank you for that. That's more than I've ever known about Lombardy or the Lombards. And it isn't a thing of passing interest to me because I've spent a lot of time in Milan, and in the early 2000s, during the rise of the Liga Lombarda as a political force of the right, and their full embracing of this medieval fantasy of Lombardy. Yeah. And so I'm whenever someone complains about us doing presentist thing, I think, well, what about the right, reinventing the Middle Ages for their own crazy stuff? And I think though this is just anecdotal, maybe you can put it in your book somewhere, that one of the things that really horrified me, and I think you can find this online, there was a popular poster that the Lombard League put up in its anti-immigration campaign. And it was of a Plains Indian chief in full regalia. And it said in Italian something to the effect, they allowed immigration and now they live on reservations. Think about it. And
Wow.
I just think, there's a collision that you didn't see coming. But I just think of these ways of resurrecting this history or inventing it or reinventing it and then weaponizing it for a completely different reason are so perverse that you come down to this poster like this. So just to point out that, I think the presentism thing is a sham. I mean, and it's only been used one way as a critique. And this makes a lot of sense to me now in a certain way, hearing about the back and forward of it and the deracialization and the racialization of it. So thank you for that.
Thank you. I'll have to check that out because that is one thing that I'm also interested in is, these contemporary uses as well. So I'll have to look that up.
Thank you very much. This is fascinating. I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit more to the point you drew at the end, in which queens' ethnicities or origins are brought into question, but men's aren't. And I'm thinking about some much later medieval stuff where I've spotted similar parallels about what is the quote unquote identity of this foreign or maybe not foreign queen. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that. Are there any particular patterns that arise beyond that, or just anything else you could say about that would be fascinating?
Yeah, I mean, the kind of two ways to attack women in this period were their sexuality, and that really endures in, throughout Europe and beyond, but especially in Italy through the early Middle Ages, in the Carolingian period and the Kingdom of Italy. Under the Ottonians, there's a lot of kind of scandal and impugning. The polemics are really women's sexuality. And we have that here as well. But the other way, maybe if you can't, or just if you're going to do something else, is by basically saying, no, they're not really whatever. They're not really Lombard. They're not really Ostrogoth. And it is interesting. That's something that, the thing with this particularly, is that Theodolinda, even though there is some evidence that she might have had a kind of a tough time in her own time, but so that's Gundeperga's mother, is really seen as the quintessential Lombard queen. And this is something that's fascinating to me because she was the daughter of the Bavarian duke who married a Lombard king. And so she's not Lombard, but she is really kind of seen as the quintessential Lombard queen, and in later texts is remembered that way as she's the one who did all of these good things. And I mean, part of it is because she had really good ties with the Catholic Church and won the Catholic, and so in the memory, that's really a big deal. But it's her daughter that has her ethnicity questioned. It's not Theodolinda, although she probably did as well sometimes in her own time. And so there is something, it's just really interesting that that this is a way to delegitimize women that really is not applied to men. And one thing that I was just thinking about with this, and this is just a modern, in part a modern connection, but also medieval, is that women were and still are often seen as the holders of tradition. And so a way to really be well, this person is not, is to delegitimize them, is to say, but they're not really of that group. Because women are often able to, when they're allowed to, can join a different group. And this is the case with the queens as well. And so this is the case with Theodolinda. And I always just remember, this is a personal anecdote, but I was dating a person many, many years ago who had an Italian father and an Italian family. And I would not have known that the mother was Irish from an Irish family at all if I hadn't been told that. Because she then learned all the Italian recipes and was really the one that held together this big Italian family. And that's something that, and so she was allowed to, she's part of this big Italian family. You think of her as Italian. And it's a sort of similar thing. It's also very traditional family at play here. But the way that you attack a woman then, is by saying, no, they're not really that. And so it is a political tool. But, you know, it is a way to really kind of cut them down. So you're either going to talk about their sexuality or you're going to talk about their ethnicity. Whereas for men, because, you know, men had political participation, yeah, you're impugning their manliness in a lot of ways. Although what's interesting about that as well is that in both the cases, in the Ostrogothic example and also in the case of Gundeperga's brother, they're likened to, these things are things that are kind of considered Byzantine. These are things that are associated with Byzantineness. It's unmanly, and that's also why, but it is also associated, it's associated with foreignness, but they're not considered foreign. And so there is really a difference there, a gendered difference.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I feel like this is one of the very few academic spaces where we don't really have to stress the stakes of what we do, which is fantastic. But now I have to ask like the other worst question to get, which is with how much of sort of the knowledge that we generate as academics never makes it to the public, and with how public the opponent's campaign is in this case. How do we distill this and make it useful to a non-academic audience?
So I actually love this question, probably because I teach a 4-4 course load, and it's by teaching it. I mean, there are other ways. There are a lot of public-facing historians, but I've had to think about it a lot. One, because I care about it, but two, because I'm like, well, I teach like 200 students a term, so that's a lot. So, you know, and I teach a lot of intro classes, and so it's via, we can definitely do it by teaching students, and especially in 100-level classes, who then, you know, can be like, hey, that's not right when somebody says something. I mean, there definitely are other ways of disseminating it, but I think for many of us, teaching is really the way to do it.
Thank you.
Yeah, so people remotely can hear you as well.
Because it's such an interesting question, especially given how much the right has weaponized social media platforms. And I have a colleague in the history department here at U of T who has been paying attention to the use of Instagram algorithms and how a lot of these folks who are armchair historians are nonetheless identifying themselves as historians in ways that allow them to take up a lot of space on these platforms. And so I take the point, and I think we all take the point of the classroom being an important space, but there is also, meanwhile, this other world that is unfolding with or without our participation. So there is something to be said for, and I say this as someone who like an 100-year-old doesn't like social media, doesn't use social media, and yet there is that fact that plenty of people are making use of it in ways that when you type in the hashtag historian on Instagram, it's filled with people on the right wing, right? Like these white nationalists who are abusing, in the way that you've already pointed out, these historical actors and references in ways that we'll all have to live with, right? Yeah,
no, you're absolutely right. And I should add that, like, Twitter, I do a lot with that. I didn't even know about that Instagram thing, so that's that's noted. But yeah, no, I do think social media is really important for that as well, because it is where you're going to get so many people. Thank you.
Nicole, I just wanted to ask you, you mentioned that the Roman Empire, I think the phrase you used was didn't have a concept of whiteness. And I wanted to hear you talk about whether they had a conception of race, because I think it's important not to assume that, you know, race means, oh, well, we've got white, black, red, you know, the colors that come to characterize the Atlantic world. So I wanted to hear you sort of talk about what race might have looked like in ancient Rome, and then into the early Middle Ages.
Sure. Yeah, I do think that the Romans had a conception of race, and it's based on Romanness. And a lot of it was actually, and so this is somewhat contentious, although there are a group of classicists who have really put forward that work. Shelley P. Haley was the one who was saying, who was really saying they don't have a concept of whiteness, but other scholars, Benjamin Isaac and a couple of others said, you know, like, but they do have a concept of race. Some of them don't want to say race absolutely. Some will say proto-racism, but proto-race or proto-racism. But basically, they do operate on environmental theories, and everyone agrees that these things exist, where the Mediterranean, and the Greeks were like this as well, the Mediterranean is sort of the center, and it's great. And then everyone on above and below go further and further from that, and they are biologically different, and often inferior because of that. So they absolutely do have I believe they absolutely do have an idea of race. And then in the Middle Ages, in the later Middle Ages, as Geraldine Hang, a bunch of other people have really looked at this, you know, you do have these ideas about race that really are based on Christianity, but really particularly Roman Christianity, that and that conceive of Jews and Muslims, and Kaplan in Figuring Racism also does actually tie in with Africans who at that point were following a traditional religion or Islam as racially different. Between that, and actually, Kaplan, what's interesting there is like that's sort of the link to then later ideas of racism. But the period that I'm looking at, I think there's a sort of that's not racial yet. But you do have in this period, it's really churchmen, but they are there's a category collapse of Muslims, pagans, polytheistic peoples, and Jews. And it starts as polemical texts. They're really, in this period, it's really just churchmen who are kind of yelling about this. But that does then later on get taken and grafted onto actual peoples. And I think it starts just after when I'm talking about with the conquest of basically, the conquest of Saxons, and you know, you have arguments that they're not, already with the Saxons, so in the late 8th century, that that one of the reasons that they won't accept Christianity is because of their nature and things like that. And so you do start to get that stuff coming together. I do think it takes longer, in part because there's not, yeah, I mean, it takes hundreds of years for that to really be hegemonic. But what's also interesting to me, just as a brief aside, is this idea of environmentalism never went away. So, because I mean, that's that Roman tradition and Greek before that. You know, when all of the people that are thinking about these things did have that education, and you see that all the way into probably today a little bit, but definitely into the 19th and 20th century with white concerns about degeneration if they stay too long in Africa and things like that because of the climate and everything. So like you do have things that are traced from the beginning. I usually am not concerned so much with origins or teleology. I really do. I'm really interested in what's different most of the time, or how things change over time. But you do have some strands that really kind of pull through the whole time.
yeah, I will have Jonathan Chu be the last question.
And thank you so much, Nicole. This is such a fascinating paper. I learned so much from your talk. This is just a naive question, but it's just an invitation for you. I'd love to just hear your thoughts. So I'm interested in, how constructions of Romanness are so paradigmatic, right? So for these conversations, in the period you're discussing and today as well. How does citizenship fit into this picture? Does a discourse of Roman citizenship morph into something else in the materials you study? I'm also thinking about now, of course, contemporary Italy. Black Italians are constructed as perpetual migrants, unfit. They're not citizens, right, by birth. So again, it's an invitation just to talk about where you see that fitting in pre-modern racial thinking. Thank you.
Sure. No, it's super interesting, and one of the kind of critiques of talking about race in Rome itself is, but people could become Roman citizens. So there are two things about that. The first is, in the earlier period, yes, that's true, but there were really specific things that you had to do to become a Roman citizen, and citizenship was passed down via lineage. And so unless you actually worked for the state, basically, service to the state, usually via serving as an auxiliary troop, that's really the way that you get citizenship. Or being in a province that was like Roman for a really long time. At a certain point, citizenship would just be extended. But usually it was via specific service to the state, and it only applied to that soldier, the man who got that citizenship, and their partner, which could be a wife, didn't absolutely have to be, but their children who were born before the citizenship grant was given were not given citizenship. Only children who were born after the grant of citizenship would get citizenship. So there definitely are these biological lineage things that are happening even in that earlier period. By my period, and so after 212, everyone in the empire was a citizen. And so that stops being so meaningful. So at that point, you're a Roman. So I'm sure there were different things going on within the empire as well, but for the period that I study, there's, Roman citizenship was, everyone within the empire who was born within the empire, was a citizen. But in the early Middle Ages, it's actually interesting because you actually get, and I need to look into this more, but you do actually get the Romans, by which it probably means the people of Rome, and it's a little unclear about how far that extends, but as their own kind of gens. Which is fascinating to me because Rome in the 6th and 7th centuries was a really cosmopolitan city. And so you have people from all over, not just all over the empire, but also areas, not just all over Italy, but all over the empire, but also people who were, merchants and everything. Also, there's a lot of North Africans and people from areas in the 7th century, especially from areas that went under Muslim conquest. You do have a large influx into Rome, and so it's actually this really cosmopolitan city, and it's really connected into the Mediterranean, not so much like Italy and northern Italy and Europe. And so the idea that then the Romans are people again is very, I have to look into it more, but it's just, the idea does morph, Romanness does change. But similarly, when you're looking at it, there is an emphasis on biology the whole time, but how that biology actually relates to human bodies historically, there is a disconnect, which to me is really, really fascinating.
Okay, thank you so much. And everyone, please join me in thanking our final speaker for the day today.